You are listening to Frog Talk, presented by Black Ribbon.
Thank you so much for joining me on Frog Talk. Today, I really want to dive into how organizations can create thriving work cultures where employees genuinely want to contribute. We're exploring how organizations can move beyond meeting metrics and hitting KPIs to build truly aligned cultures where purpose, integrity, and performance work in harmony. We'll examine how leaders can address toxic cultures, break down silos, and create environments where both people and businesses thrive. I have the great pleasure of speaking with Tammy Fitzpatrick, founder and CEO of the Fitzpatrick Collective. Tammy is an organizational alignment expert who helps businesses navigate transformative change, optimize team performance, and guide leaders towards sustainable success through human-centered approaches. Welcome, Tammy.
Thank you, Nader. Thanks for having me today.
Absolutely. It's so good to have you here. To begin right off the bat, I like to try and connect dots between where you are now, where you were, and how you even got here. So was there sort of a catalyst in your life that inspired your focus on organizational culture? Culture work seems to be more of like a modern thing, certainly even in my perspective. So when we talk about human-centered leadership and organizational culture, what made you even become interested in that?
Yeah, we're going to dig right into the kind of foundational components with me from the beginning. I like to speak very openly about being a fifth generation farm girl. I mean, I grew up on an Iowa farm, gathering eggs before I went to school, running barefoot through the fields, riding, horses and doing all kinds of crazy and fun things. But it was a working farm. And so every day as the hired men would gather around the table, I would have an opportunity to hear the stories that they would tell. And, sometimes they were crazy fishing stories. Sometimes they were stories about who was carrying their weight on the farm. They might have just been a lot of stories about how they felt about their work. And that really inspired me to start thinking about, at a very, very young age, how do people identify with the work that they do? And how do they feel about it at the end of the day? Through 5 generations, my family identified as farmers. That's all they knew. And it was their blood and the life that they gave to their community every single day. And so at the end of those days, I also got to hear my family talk about whether the crops were going to yield, if they could afford the new tractor that they needed, and how all of that impacted their lives. And so, again, at a really young age, I started having those conversations around the dinner table about culture and identity and how they felt about the work that they were doing.
Did the words culture ever come up? Did that word ever come up?
Okay. No.
How did you start sort of connecting what was it inherently to you? Because I have I don't know if similar is the right word. But in terms of sort of picking up on identity cues at a very young age because of my upbringing. But what was it that sort of stuck out to you specifically?
I think it was a lot about how the work that they did made them feel. And it impacted everything about how they identified, not only in their personal lives, in their professional life as farmers, but also within their community and how they related with other people. They never defined it as culture, but they spoke about those same variables and those same components in much the same way that people do today.
Right. And I am assuming, actually, let me rephrase, was your community a community of farmers as well?
Yes.
Yeah. Where you grew up in that area and so on?
Absolutely. And that
Did
was a
you
large
interact?
part of all of their identities.
Right. So who was on the, on the land with you with respect to your family?
On the
Was
land?
it grandparents and uncles, aunts? Was it everybody?
It was everyone within a very small community. I went to school with my cousins. I was taught by my dad's same kindergarten teacher. It was grandparents, great grandparents, and lots of aunts, uncles, and cousins within that community all working together.
Yeah, that's amazing. I don't have roots. So I grew up moving around a lot my entire life, and internationally, like leaving countries, completely different societal cultures, ethnicities, language, ways of life, and so on. And so when I was the moment like what you're describing clicked for me was when I was around 8 years old in Indonesia. And we were I always describe my upbringing as I grew up in a party because my mother threw parties all the time, like every weekend practically. And whether it was for my dad's work colleagues or for their social circles or otherwise. And it was sort of between moving a lot and being overstimulated by all the newness all the time, and uh, being in these sort of parties, I was developing a very astute sort of observational skill, and I was just kind of seeing everything and interactions. And I started noticing this word certainly didn't exist in my vocabulary, but the interconnectedness of all things, of like people, places, and things. And one thing that really stood out to me was that in at these parties we had people from all walks of life, ethnicities, backgrounds, age, status, stature, and so on, class. My dad was in the oil space, so there was very, very wealthy people at these parties. And then we had our housekeepers and our caterers and so on. So it was just this entire line of hierarchy. But at these parties, everybody, and I mean everybody, was at the same level. Like everyone was there for the same reason, to have a good time, to escape from the realities of their day and so on. And it just showed me that people are inherently the same. When they left the party, all those labels came back into existence. But for 5-6 hours, they were just gone. And that was really interesting to me. And like what people as humans really value, and like what that is all about.
That's fascinating to be able to see a group of people come together and rejoice and celebrate at a party, um, and put all of whatever differences that might impact their day to day life, uh, have those aside.
Absolutely. So then, did you actually go to school for like industrial psychology or organizational culture or anything like that specifically?
I did. I took my first job off that farm in a local community bank and was introduced to this concept called college. I'd never heard of it before. They didn't really talk about it in school in those farming communities, which sounds people are their minds are typically boggled by that. Like what you grew up and you weren't really even introduced to the concept of college. I wasn't. It wasn't something the farming community thought was even necessary. And so thankfully, this first job, the president of the bank at that time said, "Hey, are you interested in what are you doing in your future? Have you thought about going to college?" And I had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. And it was the moment that changed my life. It absolutely changed my life. I was fascinated in that first banking job because they were going through merger and acquisition, and there was a lot of chatter around the water cooler. The companies had done their due diligence. It made sense on paper, but they were not considering the people component of that. So it influenced me again at a really young age to start thinking about what organizations are doing and the strategies and what their goals might be are impacting the people that they are serving. So I went off to college. That was a really big deal for me. My family wondered why I was doing this thing and paying for it. They thought that was a little crazy. And so I went off to college and I studied business, I studied psychology, and eventually went to get a PhD in industrial organizational psychology because I continued to be fascinated by the way that we bridge the employee experience within the organizational setting.
When you said this concept called college, the way you threw that in there made me go, "What's college?"
Right?
I was like, "What is that concept?" And then then it clicked. It took me a minute. I'm ashamed to say. I was like, I don't know what that is either. Um,
That was exactly my experience all those years ago.
So tell me a little bit about your business, the Fitzpatrick Collective. How did that come to be? Through your, when did that launch? First of all.
That's a relatively newer initiative for me. It was not launched about 2 years ago. I've had multiple consultancies over the years as I've gone in and out of corporate environments and doing consulting work as well. So the Fitzpatrick Collective is relatively new, but the work that I'm doing in that space is absolutely not. I've had the pleasure to be employed in the finance industry, aerospace industry, healthcare industries, in university settings for many, many years. But the Fitzpatrick Collective is really the combination of those experiences and my opportunity to be able to serve my clients from what I call strategic execution. So, really helping them understand what's happening diagnostically within their organization and then figure out how they can prioritize what they need to focus on based on their goals and objectives moving forward. And oftentimes, that could be strategy, it could be implementation. A lot of times in my space, it's the people component.
What kind of clients are you typically working with? You brought up M&A earlier. Is M&A involved in that? If it is, when are they approaching you? If it's not, when are they approaching you?
Yeah, so M&A is a big part of the work that I do, but typically it's anytime an organization's in what I would call some level of transformation. They're wanting to grow, transform. M&A is an easy in for that. Sometimes it's company A is coming in, they're getting ready to go to market. They know they're going to be selling and they really want to make sure that they're prepared to be able to do that and bring top dollar for their business and get everything aligned in preparation for that. Sometimes company B knows they're about to be they're going to buy an organization and they really want to know what that looks like for them. And a lot of times it's on the backside. Again, due diligence is such a big part of the process in the M&A. And so many of these folks, it makes sense on paper. Like they see it, they've run all the numbers, they looked at the products, they've looked at the services. It makes sense on paper. But there's a reason why about 70 to 90% of them fail is because they really miss the cultural component of that and how they can bring those two companies together to create the success. So you can have all the strategy in the world. It can look beautiful on paper, but if you don't have the people and the culture to be able to successfully execute that, you're going to struggle. And they just don't know how to measure that and look at that successfully from a due diligence perspective. So I can be brought in any phase of that when the awareness is they need to do something to be prepared.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've talked about this before. It is it is the component that's more often than not missed. Um, which I find fascinating that it's ignored, because for someone like myself or even you, it's the first thing I think about. And in my in the work that I do, we're interested in making sure that the all of that, everything that you're putting together from the people first component, is understood and acknowledged, that they affect your brand. These activities, these considerations, these efforts, and so on, everything that you do, right, affects and impacts your brand and how people perceive your company. So when you talk about preparing companies for their exits and getting the best value out of that, that really resonates with me, because I always say, if you build as if you're trying to exit, then you will actually have the market bidding on you. You don't even have to go to market. You're already in the market and your reputation precedes you, and you will have people knocking on your door. I just find that so interesting, was people talk about, in M&A, it's a common conversation. We go to market, we're going to go find buyers, we're going to go find the right establishment and companies, to buy this company and so on. And I always think, if you just prepped ahead of time with brand in mind to build your reputation, which requires everything you're describing and all the stuff, all the operations, the finances, and so on. If everything is just well oiled and people above and below it, then you're going to have people knocking on your door. I mean, inevitably.
And unfortunately, I find that so many of these leaders are caught up in the day to day. They're almost in survival mode. They don't know what they don't know. They're focused on, whatever we measure is ultimately what matters. And so they're so caught up on profits, goals and objectives, being accountable to their shareholders or whoever is watching out for them. They're wanting to meet those key objectives. And I'm so oftentimes told, I don't have time for that. Or what I find most often is it's not, they just don't know how. They know it's important, but they really don't know how to tackle it and do it correctly.
And then it feels overwhelming, and so they end up ignoring it. So what in your experience, what are the first signs that an organization sees or feels that indicates a culture is beginning to erode? Even when sort of performance metrics look positive. That's what's always interesting to me.
They're succeeding despite themselves. And that's a really fortunate fortunate for the leaders and unfortunate for all the people that are involved within that organization. And so oftentimes what I find is they're meeting their metrics and they might be, succeeding on paper, but they're struggling. And what we typically see is they're struggling to grow and they're becoming stagnant. And so whatever successes they may have had early on or prior, they're not able to sustain the level of growth that they need to remain viable within their industries. And so those become pain points for them. Sometimes those pain, so for me, it's typically growth related and or stagnation within their market, and they're just not able to stay as competitive as they need to. That's usually the biggest pain point that a leader can put their thumb on and say, I've got to do this. We've been struggling for the last couple of years. I'm going to use air quotes, I'm doing everything right. On paper, they've got strategy, they're executing, they're fully staffed, fully funded, yet they just cannot level up their business and they can't figure out. So those are kind of the obvious pain points for a leader.
Just from my own experience, I know this happens so often. How do you deal with contention, like hitting brick walls in leadership? Leadership who there. Let me rephrase. There are groups of leaders. If it's not a single person, for example, where there's internal conflict within the leadership team. Some of them are pushing for this. Others, usually either the COO or the CFO, are like, especially the CFO, are like, no, this doesn't make sense. It's not worth it, and so on. Or they don't see the future outcome. How do you deal with those kinds of challenges? Do you have any examples you could share?
Yeah, so I actually have inventory that I utilize that really looks at the alignment of the leadership team. I find very oftentimes I sit in those same boardrooms with those leadership teams and they're bobbles. They're bobbleheads. Remember those little baseball guys that
Yep.
you say they're bobbleheads, right? And that's what they do around that boardroom table. They bobble. They nod their head. Yep, yep, I get it. Yep, we understand. Yep, here's the strategic plan. Yep, yep, yep. That's what they do. They're bobbleheads. You can envision it. And then what happens as soon as they walk out of that room? They've got their own objective, their own
Yeah.
goals.
Back to
They're in a silo of their team, or they're not really sure how to communicate that information effectively to the rest of the organization.
Yeah.
So my starting point with every client is making sure that their leadership team is aligned and calling it out. And that can be a big hurdle that we overcome. It's not hard to overcome that hurdle, but it's a clear point that we need to address from the very beginning. If we don't have strong alignment from the leadership team, we're not going to accomplish a whole lot more after that. And so that leadership alignment is critical in the very first way and place that I start with every one of my clients, is because once we've got that alignment, then we can figure out how we're going to navigate that moving forward and eliminate the bobblehead response and really get them clearly aligned with where we're going and what we're going to be accomplishing, for the next 6 months, year, 3 year, whatever their goals and objectives are.
So how do you then ensure that they see your approach or solution as unquestionable?
Part of that alignment process is getting them to buy into where the organization is going. And it's not really a discernment in regard to one of them thinks we're going, CFO usually has his own goals and objectives that oftentimes align or don't align with the long-term strategy. So how do we bring that all into place? And they're creating that alignment. They're creating the strategies and the goals and objectives. I'm not telling them what to do. I'm helping them, guide them to come to that level of understanding so that they can take the steps forward. But quite honestly, we've got to get their egos out of the way. And that's the biggest thing that we're dealing with. And I typically will very kindly and politely tell them, your egos are what got you here. Now let's help you get to the next level where you need to go.
Yeah, it's always ego every single time. My favorite is just the idea that like M&A, it's so typical in M&A because everyone thinks they're somehow going to be different than the previous examples that we can just list off on our fingers. The notion that the statistics are what they are, and are based on decades and decades of longitudinal data. And somehow this person is different. I always say, I'm like, you're not Jesus Christ. Like, you're not going to be different than the rest of the ones who came before you. There's a reason that these numbers exist. And they're like, no, we got it. My favorite is when I've actually heard, this makes my skin crawl. I've heard COOs explain to me with pure confidence that they know every single one of their staff inside and out. They're like, I know how all my people think. I know how they feel. I'm like, 70 people. I would, my eyebrow would crook even if you had 3 people on your team. You're telling me 70 people inside and out. You don't know your own kids as well as you think you do. Like, nobody knows anybody that well. And it's just crazy.
I'm kind of laughing at that because I was like, could you keep a straight face when they tell you that? Or those are one of those moments where you really just want to laugh out loud. Like, really? 70 people, you got this. Then why am I here? Like,
yeah, exactly.
What are you doing?
And my reaction is not as cheery. I actually get angry when they say that. I'm like, I can't even, just the sheer arrogance in that statement makes me so mad that I just look at them like I actually say that. I said that one time. I was like, do you realize the arrogance in that statement? And they're kind of like, no, but I do. And I'm like, okay then. This
They're
is
their
where
own worst enemy.
I know
They really
exactly.
are
They really are
in that situation.
Yeah, this is where I answer 2 fundamental questions in my program. The fundamental questions are, why would anyone want to buy from you, and why would anyone want to work for you? In those conversations, when I either ask those questions, and the responses are kind of all over the place, because the responses should be very clear and simple and direct. It shouldn't be a whole complicated story. It should be like one thing, and in both cases. And in the case of like, I know everybody who works for me, I know all those things, or puttering around the response for why anyone would want to engage with this place, I just go even further and say, would you want to work for you? Or would you want to buy from you? And those have been proving to be very effective questions, because regardless of the answer that you get, it's interesting. If they say yes, it's interesting. If they say no, it's interesting. And it starts allowing for very serious, deep, self-reflective conversations where you start digging at all the little bits and pieces that make up this organization in its entirety, right? And that's when the egos start to really get checked, because my favorite is when they say no. I love it when they say no. They're like, no, I'm a
At
horrible,
least they're honest.
yeah, they're like, I'm a tyrant. I would hate to work for me. And I'm like, okay, we can start there. Let's start there.
I love the simplicity and the clarity that comes from those two questions. I mean, they're not challenging questions.
No.
They're very direct, but they get to the heart of what you really need to understand within the company and with those leaders.
They're really good, just first questions, because to your point, they just start peeling away at everything. They start noticing things that we're not even talking about. You start thinking like if it's a brick and mortar, would you want to work for you? I don't know. I hate our front office. Like like something like something that seems so trivial, but it overall impacts the total experience. Since that's what you're talking about, right? You're talking about the experience, the human experience in every sense of the word, in every capacity. What is it like when they wake up and think about having to go to work? What is it like when they're driving, thinking about getting to work? What is it like when they get to work? What is it like when they're there? What is it like when they leave? What are they thinking about after leaving work? I mean, this is all relevant stuff, and it has everything to do with the experiences. You talked about silos earlier. How do you even approach breaking down silos in organizations that are sort of archaically hierarchical? I know I've dealt with those. So what happens in your model?
Ooh, I think silos are oftentimes the death of most organizations. Those leaders they're in the head of different departments, they're doubling down for the teams that they support, and they go to bat for the team that they support. And so leaders, and I've been in a lot of rooms with a lot of leaders that say, yeah, but my job is to lead and support my people. I've got to fight and they feel as if when they show up every day at work, they're putting on their battle gear and they're going in to fight for their team. It might be their budget. It might be their parking spaces, as silly as, simple as that. It might be for whose project gets to, move forward. And they're constantly, and they said, but that's the sign of a good leader. And I said, you're playing for the wrong team. When your mindset is all about fighting for the team that you lead, you're really fighting for the wrong team. And you've lost the larger goals and objectives of the organization and what it is that you're trying to accomplish there. And so if you come into a larger leadership meeting, the C-suite executives come in and all they're doing is battling it out for their team and their silo, then they're just continuing to create and foster those negative workplace dynamics versus thinking about how do we move the organization? Because if the organization wins, we all win. I always think of the football team. Is it offense? Offense and defense aren't playing against each other, battling at the same game. They're each have their individual roles so that the larger team wins. And so when we start thinking about that from an organizational perspective, we've got to break down those silos. And oftentimes it seems simple, but it's one of the hardest things is communication. So how do we have clear objectives? And then how do we communicate that within the larger organization?
It's true. It's an interesting sort of psychological moment because those leaders feel like they're doing something good, right? And in essence, they are. It's not inherently bad that you're going to bat for your team. It's actually a good quality, but you're sort of losing the bigger picture at the same time when you're pigeonholing yourself into that role. So to your point, now you have competition within the greater organization, and that's counterproductive.
They have to have those clear goals and objectives at the top, and then be able to really communicate those effectively. And I want to know with my clients how that trickles down to every level within the organization. The frontline employees, they should understand what they do every single day and how that contributes to the larger goals and objectives of the company. And most of the times they don't.
You brought up a good point. Are you going through the entire organization, or are you just talking to leadership?
My favorite answer there is it depends. It depends on the organization and the client. I will say that I always start at the top. We've got to have strong leadership alignment and really clear goals and objectives at the top. And then we figure out what that means for different layers, depending on the organization and how far we need to go down into that. Oftentimes, we find mid level managers, they were really good at the tasks that got them promoted to those positions, but they are not really prepared to be able to effectively lead people. And so a lot of times we're helping create those communication patterns and really how we navigate that communication strategy within the organization to be able to effectively help them lead their people.
How long does it typically take you to build and deliver your programs?
So my initial program is 6 weeks, and then we do follow-ups every 6 months. So we get in, we move the needle as quickly as we can. Speed and essence of execution is key. In most organizations and industries, they don't have 6 months to figure out what's happening and how can we solve for it. They're missing metrics if we can't move faster than that. So the initial is 6 weeks, and then we'll do follow-ups every 6 months, kind of depending on what we're trying to accomplish and what they're preparing for organizationally with those objectives. If they're going to market, or if they're just trying to grow. I'll say it depends, but think 6 weeks and then 6 months.
And your deliverable is what exactly at the end of that 6 weeks?
So 6 weeks, we do diagnostic assessments, and then we do strategy review and execution. So we're going to lay the foundational work for them diagnostically. Where are they? So do assessments with them that kind of peel back the layers of the onion so they understand really clearly where we're at today. And it gives them kind of a little bit of a wellness check of where they're at from their strategy implementation, how they're using their resources, and then their people or a cultural perspective. And then we'll make sure that their leadership is fully aligned, their strategy is sound, and then I'll help them with the initial execution components of that.
Okay, yeah, you just answered my question. So you help them execute. And how long does that initial execution take?
Again, it's about 6 months. We're going to come back and do that follow. So we're laying all the foundation and helping them understand where they are, where they're going, and what do they need to do to get there. Now, sometimes I'll stay on depending on the intensity of the project. Sometimes they're doing pretty well. Their well check comes back and diagnostically they're doing great. They just need a few minor adjustments. But sometimes we have to get in a little more hands-on. It's the farm girl in me. I'm rolling up my sleeves and I'm getting dirty with them, right? Like we're in there doing the work. I'm not working in their business. I'm helping the leaders work on their business.
That's fantastic. And so tell me a story about, outcome, positive outcome. What is like the ultimate, what makes your heart sing with your clients?
I've got a long-term client that I've been working with for many, many years. Think over a decade, and helps them develop leadership and been through several kind of merger and acquisition projects with them, and followed this leadership team kind of from one institution, went through merger and acquisition, then we went to the next one. And so we've got a long-term standing relationship. They went in to do a cleanup project on an organization about 2.5 years ago. And when we met strategically shortly after that, they were going to come in, clean up this organization, and prepare it for sale. So that's kind of, if you think of the process of these clients that I work with, they go in, they clean up a project organization, and then they sell it. And that's just been the rhythm we've been on for a long time. So we launched a new strategic initiative with them early last year, and their go-to-market. So they had about a 3-year window for go-to-market. We did the strategic initiatives. We looked at the organization a little deeper, and we found that they're not going to market. They're actually growing and transforming this organization, and their goals and objectives have changed tremendously. And you'll say, why did it change? Like they're the fix and sell people, because they found that the culture within that organization was honestly like nothing I've ever seen before. And which is really shocking in an organization that was struggling under failed leadership before that. But they transformed the culture, which transformed the business, and they're seeing profits it's like my star child right now. I just sing the praises of this company because
Wow.
the culture, a sound culture changed their objectives because they saw the potential that they had based on their people, and their profits are soaring beyond even their wildest dreams. And so, in fact, I just talked to them last
You're
week and
giving
said,
me goosebumps.
what's going on? And they said, this is the leadership team. So I'm in there doing assessments, helping them understand their leadership and develop their leadership team. And because they're so vested in their people are so vested in them.
Right.
And because their front line people are so passionate about the business because of how they feel when they show up for work every single day, it's rippling out into their community. So now their sales, it's going through the roof. And I talk a lot about the ripple effect, how the people feel every single day when they come to work will feel impacts their community. Because when you go home at the end, if I have a bad day, and people have heard me say this before, if I have a bad day, guess who else has a bad day?
Your
My
family.
husband
Yeah.
and my family and everyone else. My poor dog might have a bad day, right? Because it's like, you have a bad day and you take that home with you. And that impacts your communities. So when this client is there, those people are, they're singing. It's like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. They're singing when they go home from work. And so guess what? When they sing when they stop at the grocery store, and they talk to the community cashier. And then they sing when they stop and, are on the ballpark with their kid, because they feel good about the work that they're doing, and it's transforming their community and the business. And so the business is seeing record profits and growth that they haven't seen in years because of their people. And there's a lot of power in that.
That's so beautiful. That they're a culture brand. They're a culture brand. And that's exactly how we describe that. That's no notes. That was beautiful. That was absolutely beautiful. And I love that you have that story, because that's the goal. So per that, I mean, what is sort of Tammy's vision for the future in company culture transformations, whether it's through the Fitzpatrick Collective or just globally? How do you see the business landscape either changing or being affected by these kinds of internal cultural strategic solutions?
I think the biggest thing for me, actually, funny you mentioned this. I'm writing a book that'll be out later this year about this exact topic. But it's all about intentional leadership and how we leave a legacy, not only within the organizations that we serve, but the communities that we're a part of. And so for me, if leaders, if we can think about every day, how we show up matters. And that's a choice. Are we going to show up with a chip on our shoulder, an ego? Are we going to have a bad day? Or are we going to show up intentionally with the desire to serve and create a legacy within the companies that we have the privilege, because I believe what we do every single day is a privilege, that we have a privilege to serve. And it's going to transform. If you have that intentional leadership and that's how you show up every single day at work, guess what? You're going to have a better experience at work. Guess what? When you go home, your family's going to have a better experience. How many leaders do I know that might be showing up well at work on paper, and their family lives are a mess, or they're struggling personally in some way, shape, or form because they cannot separate those two things? And so my passion is showing up, being intentional, creating a legacy that we're proud of, and changing not only our own lives, but everyone within our communities. And I think there's a lot of passion in that. So we've got to be aware of how those things are so linked, and the difference that they make.
Yeah. You got me all emotional over here.
Uh-oh.
we share a vision, man. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Absolutely amazing. Tammy, thank you so much for joining me. It was such a pleasure having you on the show. I'm glad we got to reconnect, and I look forward to speaking to you some more. Please tell our listeners how they can find you, how they can reach you if they need to, if they want to transform lives and their families and their communities.
Yeah. Well, thank you. It was an honor to be here with you today, and I really appreciate an opportunity to chat with you about all things leadership and culture. They can find me on LinkedIn. It's Tammy Fitzpatrick, PhD, and they can also check out my website at thefitzpatrickcollective.com.
Fantastic. Thank you again, and all the best.
Thanks, Nader.